The death of Gabby Petito at the hands of Brian Laundrie has been in the news again with the release of a Netflix documentary about the case. The Petito Laundrie case first gained national attention in the late summer and early fall of 2021, shortly after both Gabby and Brian would be found dead. Gabby in Grand Teton National Park in Wyoming and Brian in the Carlton Reserve in Florida. In a notebook that was discovered near Brian's body, he confesses that Gabby died at his hands. Once Brian was found dead, I stopped caring about him knowing he had taken the coward's way out and would never face justice. But after renewed interest in the case, examining the depositions of Brian's parents concerning his actions after the murder, I became curious about what Brian did after he left home, how his body was eventually discovered, and what the final verdict is from the experts about how he died. I also wanted to understand why Brian didn't just turn himself in, and why his parents didn't turn him in. Let's get started. Brian Laundrie's remains were discovered on October 20th, 2021 by his parents, Christopher and Roberta Laundrie, along with law enforcement officers during a search of the reserve, Carlton Reserve, and the Myakkahatchee Creek Environmental Park in Northport, Florida. He was 23 years old at the time of his death. The Laundries had informed the FBI and Northport police that they planned to assist in searching the area that morning. Shortly after arriving, they found a backpack and a dry bag belonging to Brian. Law enforcement then located skeletal remains nearby, which were in plain sight. Basically, as soon as Laundrie's parents got out there, they found Brian. Go figure.
Good afternoon. My name is Michael McPherson. I'm the Special Agent in charge of the FBI Tampa Division. As you're aware, the FBI and the Northport Police Department and our state and local law enforcement partners have been searching the area of the Carlton Reserve for Brian Laundrie, a person of interest in the murder of Gabby Petito. Earlier today, investigators found what appears to be human remains, along with personal items such as a backpack and notebook belonging to Brian Laundrie. These items were found in an area that up until recently had been underwater. Our evidence response team is on scene using all available forensic resources to process the area. It's likely the team will be on scene for several days. I know you have a lot of questions, but we don't have all the answers yet. We are working diligently to get those answers for you.
Now, the Carlton Reserve in Northport, Florida is densely wooded, low-lying area. It has a mix of open canopy sections where you can see the sky, and then there's sections with very thick underbrush where you can't. Now, at the time of Laundrie's disappearance, much of the reserve was actually submerged under approximately 3 feet of water. It later receded, and it revealed a bunch of inaccessible areas that had been previously unreachable. The water lines on nearby trees showed signs of recent flooding, and the ground was uneven. Now, the search for Brian was led by the Sarasota County Sheriff's Office. The Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission also assisted in the search. They provided altering vehicles, boats, and expertise in managing potential hazards such as alligators and snakes that were on the water shore and in the water. The FBI's evidence response team was also deployed to assist in processing evidence and conducting the forensic analysis. They also used cadaver dogs, which were brought in to aid in trying to locate Brian's remains before they were eventually found. Now, the site where Brian's body was found was divided into 2 areas. You had the main scene, which contained human skeletal remains and personal belongings, and then a secondary scene where additional items such as animal bones and a handwritten note were found. To systematically document the scene, the FBI and Northport Police Department established temporary shelters using tarps and canopies to temporarily catalog, store, and safeguard all the evidence that was strewn about the multiple sites. At the main crime scene, investigators were immediately able to identify some bones as human. They could clearly see a right and left scapula, right humerus, a left and right femur, tibias, fibulas, clavicles, pelvis, vertebrae, ribs, skull fragments, a mandible, and a maxilla. Again, the bones were scattered across the ground. The personal effects that were found at this location were a pair of green shorts, 2 slip-on shoes, a backpack, a white metal ring, a short-barreled revolver like a snub-nose revolver that ended up being heavily rusted due to just the dampness and rain. The secondary scene, located approximately 100 to 250 feet east of the main area, contained additional items that were considered significant to the investigation, of course. There, the police discovered the skeletal animal remains, a handwritten half note, and then a red hat with the logo Moab Coffee Roasters. There was the dry bag that was found also, and that contained a journal, a wooden box holding a small notebook, and pictures of Brian Laundrie. Brian obviously knew it was going to be wet out there, and he brought things to protect the items that he had with him from the rain and the elements. Now, due to the prolonged exposure, Brian's remains were in an advanced state of skeletonization. There was no soft tissue present. There was aside from minor traces of a waxy substance that can form on bones when they're in wet conditions. The bones were darkly stained also, which doctors say is consistent with prolonged exposure to soil and water. Anything that's going to be in dirt for a while is going to become discolored. Now, the forensic examination of Brian Laundrie's remains was conducted by Dr. Wilson A. Broussard Jr., who was at the time the District 12 medical examiner in Sarasota, Florida. Now, the doctor's examination revealed a lot of things. First, the extensive post-mortem animal scavenging. Animals had basically tore the body apart and scattered the bones about. And this was particularly evident on distal ends of the long bones. It was very much consistent with carnivore and rodent activity. The examiner would say that this type of scavenging is common in outdoor decomposition cases, especially in areas where there's a lot of different wildlife. The primary evidence of the scavenging was on the bones like the femur, the tibia, the humerus, the radius, and the ulna. Now, this is the distal ends of the bones, as I had mentioned, and they showed signs of gouging, there's punctures, scoring, and gnaw marks. Forensic anthropologists identified these as typical of medium to large carnivores, which they knew would be present out there. Even the edges of some of Brian's bones were rounded and smooth, indicating that they had been out there for a long time and a lot of animals had had an opportunity to scavenge off these bones. Now, another key aspect of the forensic analysis is ensuring that all the bones belong to the same person, and you do this through a detailed osteological inventory and completeness scoring. Investigators will assess the size, the shape, and the articulation of various bones to confirm the consistency. It's basically saying that all these bones came from the same person because both tibias are the same length, both fibulas are the same length, both ulnas are the same length, so forth. And so through this, the forensic analysis was able to prove with the bones they collected, there were no duplicate bones, meaning that there were no extra skeletons in the area to suggest the presence of multiple individuals. There's just one person out there that they found. The forensic odontological examination also confirmed Brian Laundrie's identity by comparing his dental records with the recovered maxilla and mandible, which retained several teeth. The teeth showed dental crowding, significant calculus deposits, and impacted molars. Some teeth were also lost post-mortem, likely due to the animals and the scavenging. No, he had no dental restorations or fillings present. Dr. Havens, who conducted the dental examination, was able to match Brian's unique characteristics that I mentioned, the crowding, the calculus deposits, the impacted molars, with records from a family dentistry office in New York where he had had these previous dental records done. Dr. Broussard's examination of Brian Laundrie's skull also revealed a perforating gunshot wound to the head, and this basically confirmed his cause of death as a self-inflicted gunshot wound, along with the gun being present on site. The entrance was located on the left side of Brian's head, so if you're looking at Brian, it's on the left side, while the exit wound was on the right side, and this would be consistent with Brian being a right-handed individual, which he was known to be. Now, the gunshot wound to the head, according to the forensic examination, caused significant bone loss. Basically, a giant hole was blown into Brian's head, of course, by himself. It's especially true around the entrance wound, where there was a 5.5 centimeter by 5 centimeter hole. Now, imagine how big that is. That's about 5 centimeters, is about 2 inches? 2 inches by 2 inches. The exit wound was near circular with outward beveling of the skull. It was a classic characteristic of an exit wound. As mentioned, investigators recovered that rusted .38 caliber revolver near the remains, which contained 2 live rounds and 1 spent casing. This matched all the evidence that Brian had inflicted a single gunshot wound on himself and indeed did die by suicide. Now, when asked, Laundrie's told investigators Brian was very healthy and had no known medical history. He did not take any medications and had no known primary care physician. When asked about Brian's social history, the Laundrie stated that they did not want to provide that information. So basically, they didn't want to get into anything outside of the forensic examination and the physical evidence, meaning they didn't want to talk about what was confessed in that notebook about him taking Gabby's life. Everyone already knew he did, so it didn't matter if they talked about it or not. As far as the question of if Brian had any drugs or alcohol in the system, the toxicology report found no detectable drugs or toxic substances in Brian Laundrie's remains, so he was not drugged out. He didn't even have any alcohol in the system. Now, confirming it was a single person was done by studying the bones. Confirming it was Brian was done by looking at the dental records. There were also multiple other methods used to confirm that the remains were indeed Brian's and didn't belong to another person. So one of those was a DNA analysis, which was conducted through a comparison with his known family members. The Pinellas County Forensic Laboratory extracted DNA from a femoral bone that was found at the site and a molar tooth, so both from a part of the body and the skull. And the extracted DNA was then compared to genetic samples from Brian Laundrie's parents, Christopher and Roberta. And the results showed a direct parent-child relationship. So that was the number 2 way conclusively proving Brian was indeed the owner of the remains. Now, there was also a calculation done to prove how long before he was found Brian had died. And this is called doing a post-mortem interval estimate. Basically, calculation of how long he'd been dead, as I mentioned. And this is based on a forensic analysis of decomposition, environment exposure, the scavenging activity from various animals. And this is all taken together and used by the forensic analysis to determine time of death. Given that his body had been submerged and later exposed in the environment, forensic anthropologists use aquatic and terrestrial decomposition models to really hone in and approximate when he shot himself. Based on this, the estimated post-mortem interval ranged from 47 to 60 days. And this aligned with Laundrie's reported disappearance on September 13th, 2021, and the discovery of his remains on October 20th, 2021. This also confirmed that his death occurred shortly after he went missing. He wasn't out there for a long time alive. On October 21st, 2021, Stephen Bertolino, who's a lawyer for the Laundries, confirmed the remains had been identified. The Laundries' attorney later told the media that Brian's parents were grieving privately and had no plans for a public memorial. Now, after reading through the autopsy, I started to wonder if Brian's parents ever considered that instead of helping him run off, they could have saved his life if they had just urged Brian to turn himself in. If Brian had surrendered early in the investigation, he would have faced the legal consequences of his actions, hopefully, proven by a jury or a judge in a court of law, but he wouldn't have ended up dead in the woods. Instead, facing consequences, he disappeared into the Carlton Reserve, an area known to be dangerous, likely to flood with harsh terrain, and he spent days alone before ultimately taking his life. By choosing this silence and just being complicit in his actions over cooperating also, the Laundries may have inadvertently led Brian to his death. That has to be said. If they had actually encouraged him to face the legal system, he would have at least had access to mental health resources, which he seemingly needed. He would have had the legal representation from Bertolino, and he would have had an opportunity to explain his actions, even if that meant spending the rest of his life in prison. And it would have also spared the Laundries the anguish of losing their own child. Their choice to remain silent not only prolonged the suffering of Gabby's family, but it also sealed Brian's fate. Still, Brian made his own decisions both before and after he killed Gabby. And when I think about it, I ultimately believe Brian's decision to take his own life rather than to surrender to authorities, while still wrong in my eyes, was influenced by a number of reasons. For one, he had a lot of guilt and shame over his actions, I'm sure. Maybe. I hope. That is an assumption. And he had the prospect of facing legal consequences and the growing public scrutiny. We all knew what he did. And to be honest, he didn't seem like a person with a very strong will, so he took the coward's way out. He most likely realized he was facing a long prison sentence if he ever was going to get out, and the loss of any freedom he had left. And especially with the media attention and the public hatred, I think he just couldn't cope. He was a coward who took an innocent person's life and then couldn't handle the consequences of his actions. Ultimately, Brian committed a classic murder-suicide in which a mentally ill or deranged lover, him, kills their partner and then takes his own life. It's classic, nothing new. He doesn't deserve my sympathy, and he doesn't get it. Now, Brian Laundrie was not buried. His remains were cremated, and his parents received his ashes. There is no known gravesite or public memorial for him, nor should there be. And with that, this concludes today's story. For more true crime and celebrity stories, please check out the homepage of Black Rhetoric right here on YouTube. Until next time.